just a little update. I am getting ready to hit the road, and I'm going to be sort of exploring for about the next week and a half, I think. Getting out of Dodge so they can hopefully run a bunch of people through my house, and we'll find the next wonderful seventh owner. And yeah, wish me luck on that smooth transition. It's a bit hard. I've gotten, I was out running around with Juliana in the rain the other day, and I picked up a bit of a cold. So, and I don't get colds very often, so I'm sort of drippy. But yes, and I think it may feel like it's sort of entangled with this idea of letting go of this phase of my life and my, my sweet little house. So anyway, enough about that. So I'm getting on the road, and as I've done in other times, I want to be productive. It's something I've been meaning to do. So I'm actually going up to upstate New York and visiting with some friends and spending some time looking around in areas around optics and photonics and nanotechnology. That's up in the sort of the Syracuse and Rochester area. And I've also been really interested in meaning to go up to see Palmyra, New York, which is where Joseph Smith, the founder of the church that became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had his visions and discovered the tablets in a grove in Palmyra. So I'm really interested in going up there. And, as I've been spending more time thinking about the role of faith in, possibly the interdimensional ant computer, a psychic spiritualized ant computer, the idea of having this mystical individual connection to the divine, to God, seems really important. And, I've been looking actually, really Steffers and Sean had taken the lead on this, and I haven't gotten it all mapped out yet, but really making some connections between the Great Awakening that happened in upstate New York, an area in western upstate New York called the Burned Over District, and the revival of many different faith groups at that time, and several springing up, not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the origins were in that, but also the Seventh-day Adventist, and it had a spiritual overlay. A lot of them had a spiritual direct mystical connection. So it overlapped also with the Fox sisters, who had ties to the Quakers, and that wasn't a religion per se, but the idea of communicating with people on the other side. And of course, John Fetzer of the Fetzer Institute, that works closely with the Templeton Foundation that I've been talking about on spiritual capital, he was raised Seventh-day Adventist and was as a young man, very interested, this is in the 19-teens, in radios, and made a lot of money in radio stations in Michigan. And then eventually, I think, became Presbyterian, left the Seventh-day Adventist faith, but that's linked to the Kellogg Foundation, W.K. Kellogg, and they're very, which is also, vegetarian and sort of early eugenics and early biohacking and sort of communal life. And, if you look at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which was one of the Kellogg brothers, very much into social impact finance and UBI. So I'm intrigued to go and explore upstate and to sort of get a sense. I don't have a whole agenda written down of all the places that I want to go, but, I've written one of the earlier pieces that I did was looking at Rochester and the optics industry, and a lot of the optics were not just like eyeglasses. See, these are my new eyeglasses, but militarized optics used in astronomy, lenses, and also like rifle optics and all kinds of optical things that were not just people wearing contact lenses or regular glasses. So I can't remember the name of the university in Rochester. There's two, but one of them actually had a lab that is called like the Magic Lab. So they're working on this idea of holographic reality, and again, do we already maybe live in a holographic universe with this implicate exquisite order of, boom and all of that? And are they making just a new version of the hologram with some sort of carbon nanotubes and R frequencies? And yeah, what's that all about? So I'm going to go wander around a little bit and have a look. But in that, I did want to make sort of lay out the possibility, and again, these are just some ideas that we've been exploring, but the idea of this burned over district in upstate New York and the fact that the same area has long been central in not just optics, but actually the Rochester Hospital was one of the early Flexner hospitals, again, backed by initially Carnegie, the Flexner Report, and then Rockefeller, and it was a major psychiatric institution, so I'm interested in looking at that, and then Rochester has this interesting connection to the Manhattan Project because one of the papers I had written, Kodak is also in Rochester. So it's Kodak, Bausch & Lomb, and Xerox. And Kodak, when they were making their film, it was celluloid, which is cellulose. And so they had vast tracts of forest to clear and use shredded trees, which is interesting in terms of arborization and that whole thing, to make their celluloid film, which is also like highly, highly flammable. And so I'm assuming they sold, but maybe they had an agreement with the government in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to give, to transfer a bunch of the holdings, the land holdings that they had in forestry, to the creation of the city where they were processing all the uranium for the Manhattan Project. And as part of that, there were arrangements made where they were doing research on radiation exposure of the staff. And for some reason, I guess because Kodak had this connection to the project, this Rochester hospital was one of the few hospitals that was doing the monitoring of radiation exposure. And a lot of it was done without proper patient consent. And I think even in Rochester, they were injecting people with radioactive isotopes without their consent or awareness, and it was really bad. And it wasn't only in Rochester, but there were a handful of hospitals that were involved, and Rochester was one of them. So I'm going to go look over there for that. But we're thinking about the field, right, and radiation hormesis and what that all means. So there's the psychiatric part, there's the optics part, there's the radiation part, and then there's the burned over spirituality part of not just Rochester, but broadly Western upstate New York. And so in sort of dialoguing back and forth with Sean and Steffers, one of the things that we were sort of exploring was this idea of revisiting some of the branding of the Reawaken America tour, that bus tour that happened that was so high profile during the lockdowns. And if indeed that was sort of an energetic, uplifting imprint of that energy of that spiritualization of the U.S. And again, if you go back and you look at the people who are participating in that, very polarizing figures, very much spectacular personalities, right? Very red, white, and blue. A lot of these people were promoting, alternative pharmaceutical treatments, supplements, crypto. They were part of this very strategically developed alt media influencer culture. And, they just collected tons and tons of people. And, this was this bus tour. And so again, it was creating a polarization point as they were going across America. And again, uplifting the America narrative. And that's something I've always been uncomfortable with because I think that there's a lot of myths about the United States that are incomplete. And in my opinion, a lot of this goes back to the attempted erasure of the original people of the American continent. And so that's something that really hasn't ever been addressed or dealt with. And realistically, once you realize that this isn't something coming in to get America, in fact, most of these technologies are homegrown. We develop them in Silicon Valley or in Cambridge or in Washington or in Indianapolis or in Chicago or in Austin or in Orlando, and then we export them to places like China and Japan and Ukraine, and then they further develop them because this is a global project. This creation of a synthetic telepathy networked biohybrid supercomputer, aka the noosphere, is an ongoing global project in which we're distracted by a lot of false narratives being placed in front of us that behind the scenes, at some level, people, entities understand the larger trajectory. So this was never something that people were coming to get America. If anything, America was sort of the linchpin for a lot of these technological developments. But if you think about what I'm talking about, the ant computer running on signals, right? Sorry. So signals intelligence, and the crypto and the spatial computing is all about signaling. Now, you think about that Reawaken America tour and all of the narratives around election fraud. Now, I'm not saying that there was never any election fraud, but of course, it's always problem, reaction, solution. You create the problem to get the reaction to introduce the solution you want, which is all the things we've been talking about with Jason and Leo about, alternative voting systems, right? And Seb Solomon has talked about it a little bit, about liquid democracy and futarchy, and Jeffrey Yass saying, okay, so now in the future, we're all going to vote on public policies like gambling pools, and then you get payouts if the option that you choose is the one that gets the greatest impact, right? That's all a signal. That is coordinating a signal through the superorganism. And so if you stop to think about, like, okay, maybe this goes all the way back to the cradle of civilization, right? Like maybe this goes back to, to Persia, to Sumeria, to these things, with these crossroads of the early religions, right? And that there's these esoteric knowledges that have come down through the ages about how you interact with energy fields, whether that's on the east or on the west. And those are managed sort of way behind the scenes. And then we advance in front technologies that are very materialistic in nature, right? But behind, there are these older, deeper ways of working with the field. And so if you imagine, again, Athens as this superorganism with knowledge management, that's something Jeremy Pitts has talked about and Josiah Ober has talked about and the Noosphere people have talked about. If you imagine this Reawaken America tour that's, again, all branded red, white, and blue, but red and blue being very prominent optical, optogenetic light sources. And then even some of the posters, they actually have like lightning bolts coming out of it, which is this piezoelectricity, right? Our biology is piezoelectric, so it's this electromagnetic charge frequency. And then they've set up the polarization of like the Bible versus the Great Reset. And again, why did everybody have to talk about it like the Great Reset? Those were ideas that were given to you by Davos, but everyone picked them up and they centered their conversation. And I did for myself for a little while until I got up to speed about how the logos, about how the linguistic imprinting happens and how this swarm intelligence and stigmergy happens. Like they will give you the vocabulary that you're supposed to use to talk about it. And so that enabled them to present the Bible on one side, that logos, against the Great Reset on the other. And again, driving people more and more into a conservative faith-based practice. But again, in my heart, I feel very strongly that most of these faith-based institutions, not just Christian, although the Reawaken America tour was centered on that, but they're going to be the ones doing the social services. They're going to be the ones with the data dashboards. They're going to be the ones with the spiritualized tokenization. And it is going to be framed as virtuous. It's going to be framed as a moral economy. And people, because they're so attached to their community and their belief systems, they're not going to think to question the bigger picture, right? And it's hard to say how far up the food chain people are being deceived by these systems, but I think at some level people do actually know. So anyway, so I'm going to go up and sort of see what's going on with this upstate New York, the first awakening, and then the reawakening tour. And if you imagine that if there was some entity that was tapped to do the spiritualized Great Reset, right, it would be, stereotypically, you would imagine it's the United States, because we've embraced this idea throughout the 20th century that we're the democracy, right? We're the voice of democracy for the world. And if you understand democracy is about votes, is about collective participation, is about consensus, then it would be really logical that the U.S. would be positioned to be in the vanguard of this new tokenized signals intelligence system that to my way of seeing it at this point, it is about spiritualized computing, possibly in some sort of interdimensional, like something beyond this perceived reality as we understand it. And that the photonics, the light systems, the optics, the carbon nanotubes, all of these frequencies that are, the geoengineering, that there's some overlay that's being put to network us, to bring us to scale as a unit, as a global superorganism. And, again, this goes back at, much, if you take Athens as a superorganism, it goes all the way back, but at least more recently about Julian Huxley. And his ideas about the morphic fields and UNESCO being this cultural superorganism. So yeah, so I just want to sort of lay out some of these ideas about these earlier religions, about light-based computing, how this is intersecting with the contemporary emerging technologies of Web3 and spatial computing and nano. Again, not that these energies don't exist outside of that, but that this is a new layer of doing more consensus-based coordination, token engineering coordination with game mechanics. And then to really think hard about how faith communities are fitting into this overall narrative, and specifically the conservative Christians, which I think anybody looking back can see how very clearly that was cultivated throughout the resistance dialogue, whether it's evangelical Christians or Eastern Christians or, there are many aspects of Christianity that have been foregrounded on this. And why is that? In my opinion, it's because the narrative of the moral economy, the virtuous city, is very important to the creation of the superorganism. And that our connection to the divine is through our soul-bound tokens. And so that has to be brought in very strongly. Because if people were following their soul and their heart space and how they understand God, they wouldn't go along with it. So that they definitely have to create and tell a very powerful story with polarized communities, and to make people scared of the end of the world and all these things that are being sort of laid out right now, so that they will be entrenched in those systems that will then be used to advance the larger goal. So anyway, so wish me luck this week. I'm going to get to see Leo at the end of the week, so I'm super excited, and I have a chance to connect with somebody who has sort of a rural, woodsy place on the eclipse. I'm not totally freaked out by the eclipse at all, but it's interesting. So yeah, so I'll be a little bit quiet for the next week and a half, but I'm just sort of planting some seeds for thought to think about, again, the Reawakening Tour, electricity, red, white, supplements, crypto, alternative biohacking, religion, and how all of that fits into this sort of end of the world apocalyptic narratives that we're being fed right now. For all those celebrate, wishing you the best on this Easter Sunday, and take care.